Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
What if I told you that that in like 70% of childhood sex trafficking cases, the trafficker isn't some, shadowy stranger in a dark alley?
Right, which is what we all kind of assume.
Exactly, it's a family member. And what if I told you that very same trafficker might actually be sitting right next to your patient in the exam room today, like holding their hand and answering all your questions?
Yeah, it just shatters the image most of us have in our heads. We are so trained to look for these obvious villains, but the reality of trafficking is often just, hidden in plain sight. It's wrapped up in this dynamic of false intimacy or familial trust.
That statistic alone completely changed my perspective on this. So, welcome to this deep dive. If you are a nursing student or an advanced practice student or even just a clinician trying to prep for your next rotation, consider this your ultimate last-minute lecture study session.
Oh, definitely.
Today, we are taking the clinical assessment of human trafficking, specifically from the Advanced Health Assessment of Women text, Chapter 36, and translating it into a practical guide. Because, let's be real, you aren't going to see a chief complaint of human trafficking on the intake chart.
No, absolutely not.
You're going to see, recurrent infections or chronic pain or just a patient who won't make eye contact with you.
Which means the burden is entirely on the clinician to look past the surface. This isn't about memorizing pharmacology or bone structures.
Right.
It is about recognizing the hidden signs of profound trauma. It's reading the physical clues a patient physically cannot verbalize, and then knowing exactly how to adapt your care so you don't unintentionally cause more harm.
Exactly. So let's start at the very beginning of the clinical encounter, just understanding who is actually in the room with you. So legally speaking, trafficking isn't just about, smuggling people across borders in the dead of night, right? It essentially boils down to coercion.
Right. Human trafficking, or, modern-day slavery, involves compelling or coercing a person to provide labor, services, or commercial sex. And I think the most critical thing for a student or clinician to understand is that coercion does not require physical chains.
Wow.
The coercion can be entirely psychological. It can be a threat to a family member or debt bondage or just intense emotional manipulation. A patient does not need to be physically transported from one location to another to be a victim.
But the law treats the age of the patient very differently, which seems, crucial for a clinician taking a history, because for adults, you have to prove that the Commercial Sex Act was induced by force, fraud, or coercion. But for a minor, so someone under 18, that requirement just vanishes.
Because a minor cannot consent, full stop. If a patient is under 18, any Commercial Sex Act is classified as trafficking.
Regardless of force or fraud.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if there was no overt physical force involved. The text actually categorizes minor sex trafficking into subsets, which is helpful to know. You have domestic minor sex trafficking, which involves U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents under 18.
Okay.
And then you have the commercial sexual exploitation of children, where a child is essentially treated as a commercial sexual object in exchange for something of value.
And we really can't ignore labor trafficking either, right? Where force, fraud, or coercion is used for involuntary servitude or debt bondage. But the sheer scale of it's hard to wrap your head around. The data from the source material estimates 600,000 to 800,000 people are trafficked globally every single year.
It's staggering.
And 80% of those transnational victims are women and girls.
It is a massively gendered crime, and it's happening right in our own backyards. In the U.S., the 2019 data showed over 22,000 identified victims, and the vast majority of those were in sex trafficking, WINSO, escort services, illicit massage businesses, pornography.
Which brings us back to that terrifying familial link from the start of the deep dive. Okay, let's unpack this. If 94% of sex trafficking survivors reported childhood sexual abuse, and 70% of those were abused by a family member, the implication for the exam room is just massive.
Oh, it changes everything.
Right. Like if common recruitment tactics include intimate partners and family, you cannot just ask a patient, is a stranger hurting you?
You can't. Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, the abuser might literally be the person pacing in your waiting room, or the uncle who is translating your questions for the patient.
That is so dark.
It is. This complex psychological web fundamentally changes how you have to approach the history in the exam. Traffickers don't just pick people at random. They look for unmet needs and they weaponize them.
So who is the textbook telling us is most at risk? Obviously, runaway or homeless youth. But it also specifically highlights individuals in the LGBTQIA plus community. Is that an economic vulnerability or a social one?
Really both. But it's heavily driven by social alienation. When youth are rejected by their families or their communities because of their identity, they lose their safety net. They need shelter, they need food, and perhaps most importantly, they need acceptance.
Right.
So a trafficker steps into that void, offering a place to stay and this false sense of belonging, and then traps them. And the same mechanism of vulnerability applies to youth between 12 and 16, undocumented individuals who fear deportation or folks struggling with substance abuse.
Okay, so imagine you're a student stepping into the clinic. You have a patient fitting this risk profile. Here's where it gets really interesting. How does the trafficking actually reveal itself during the history taking? Because it seems like the patient has been instructed explicitly not to give you the clues.
They absolutely have been. It's like a diagnostic escape room. So you have to look at the delivery of the history, not just the content. You might get an incredibly inconsistent timeline, or conversely, a perfectly scripted history.
Like it sounds memorized.
Because it is. They might claim they are just visiting the area.
Yeah.
And a huge red flag. They might flat out refuse interpreter services.
Because the person with them wants to control the narrative. They don't want an independent party facilitating communication and maybe asking follow-up questions.
Exactly. And behaviorally, the patient might have a completely flat affect, or they might be hypervigilant. They might defer every single question to the person accompanying them, like looking for permission before they even tell you their symptoms.
Wow.
Or they become visibly terrified if you suggest leaving the room or separating them from their companion.
I want to talk about the focused physical exam, because this feels like reading a redacted document. The patient is giving you the blacked out story, but you have to read the margins to understand the truth. What is the body revealing that the patient cannot say?
You're looking for the physical toll of a life, where their health is only valuable if it generates income. You might see signs of deep neglect, malnourishment, dehydration, or just medical conditions that are completely unmanaged. You might see tattoos or brandings that the patient refuses to discuss.
Brandings.
Yes, traffickers often use them to mark ownership.
That is horrific. And from a reproductive health standpoint, I'm assuming you're looking at multiple or recurrent sexually transmitted infections or unintended pregnancies. But what about injuries? How do you distinguish a normal, clumsy accident from trafficking?
You look for patterns and inconsistencies. Suspicious injuries include strangulation marks or bruises in various different stages of healing. You look for defensive posturing during your exam, so if they flinch or guard their body when you make a routine clinical movement. And you look for pattern injuries.
Like what?
A circular burn from a cigarette, or a distinct mark from a specific object.
The source material actually has a specific red flags box that summarizes this environment really well. It lists things like the patient having unexpected material things they shouldn't be able to afford, or being unaware of the current date, time, or even what city they are in.
Right.
A lack of ID and extreme difficulty getting the patient alone.
That combination of findings puts the clinician in a highly delicate position.
It really does, because let's play this out realistically. You're in the room, the patient refuses the interpreter, they give you a memorized, perfectly scripted story about falling down the stairs, but you're looking at patterned cigarette burns and strangulation marks. The story clearly does not match the physical trauma.
No, not at all.
So how do you document that without putting the patient in extreme danger if the trafficker demands to see their medical records later?
This is such a critical clinical skill. You do not document your suspicions as fact. The discrepancy itself is the clinical finding.
Okay, wait, explain that.
You document objectively. You write, patient presents with 3 1-centimeter circular burns on the left forearm. Patient guards abdomen during palpation. Physical findings are inconsistent with the provided history of falling downstairs.
So you definitely don't write patient is lying, likely being trafficked.
Never. Because if you aggressively confront them, say, I know you're lying, tell me who did this, you are stripping away their agency all over again. You risk severe re-traumatization. The moment you document that discrepancy, you don't start a standard interrogation. You pivot your entire approach to trauma-informed care.
Okay, let's dive into trauma-informed care, or TIC. Because the text defines trauma as any experience causing an intense psychological or physical stress reaction. It results in profound fear, a total loss of trust in others, and intense shame. And obviously, it doesn't discriminate by age, gender, or race.
Right. Trauma fundamentally alters how the brain perceives safety. So TIKE is defined as a strength-based service delivery approach. The goal is to improve patient engagement and health outcomes while actively avoiding re-traumatization.
It's like if a patient comes in with a shattered bone, you wouldn't roughly yank their arm to examine it. Trauma-informed care seems like applying that same physical precaution to their psychological state.
That's a perfect analogy. It recognizes that the healthcare environment itself, the authoritative doctors, the vulnerable physical exams, the loss of clothes, can be incredibly triggering.
The chapter outlines 6 key principles of TIC: safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and finally, cultural, historical, and gender issues. But honestly, as a student with a 15-minute clinical slot, how to actually operationalize empowerment and transparency? Like, how does that practically work when I just need to get a blood pressure and a history?
What's fascinating here is that it isn't about taking 45 minutes to do a 15-minute job. It's about changing the psychological dynamic of the encounter. Trauma strips a person of their choices. Trauma-informed care gives those choices back, no matter how small.
So just minor adjustments.
Yes. It means saying, I need to take your blood pressure. Is it okay if I touch your arm? It means asking, would you like the door left open a crack or completely closed?
Oh, wow. It's like reestablishing neural pathways of safety. You're proving that their voice actually dictates what happens to their body in that room?
Exactly. You are shifting the power dynamic from, I am the authority figure demanding compliance, to, I am a partner in your care. The text also provides specific screening tools to guide this, rather than just winging it.
Right, like the brief trauma questionnaire, the adult human trafficking screening tool, and importantly, the peer tool. I was hoping we could walk through the peer tool because textbooks love acronyms, but what does it actually look like in conversation?
Sure. So PEER stands for Provide Privacy, Educate, Ask, Respect, Respond. First, provide privacy. You have to separate the patient from whoever accompanied them. You might need to use a clinical excuse like hospital policy requires all patients to get their vital signs done privately, or just wait until they need to use the restroom.
Right, getting them alone is step 1. Then educate.
Yes, educate them in a normalizing way. You don't just spring heavy questions on them. You say, because violence is so common in our community, I talk to all my patients about their safety.
Yeah.
It removes the stigma. They don't feel singled out.
That makes a lot of sense. Then ask. And the text has a very specific box of screening questions, box 36.4. I noticed these questions don't ask, are you a victim of modern-day slavery?
No, because they likely don't identify with those terms at all. The questions focus on autonomy and environmental control. So you ask, can you leave your job if you choose to? Has your family been threatened? Where do you actually sleep? Do you have physical possession of your identification?
It's brilliant because it sidesteps the defensive wall. And then the 2 R's, respect and respond.
Respect means accepting their answer, even if they deny everything or refuse help. You validate their current choices. And respond means having resources available when they are ready.
Which leads right into the immediate management phase. Let's say you've established some trust using the peer tool, and the clinical indicators are all pointing to trafficking. What is the very first clinical rule the text gives for management?
Treat the chief complaint and any emergent issues immediately.
So what does this all mean? Like, meaning today, not at a follow-up appointment next week?
Correct. It sounds like we have to treat the visit like a one-and-done opportunity. If they come in with symptoms of an STI, you do the testing and you provide the treatment right then and there. Trafficked persons often do not return for follow-up care.
Because they can't.
Exactly. The trafficker might move them to a different city or simply punish them for the visit and forbid them from returning. If you delay treating an STI or providing HIV prophylaxis because you want to wait for lab results on Thursday, you have likely failed that patient.
Man, that urgency completely changes how you view the clinic visit. What about forensic evidence? If we see those patterned injuries, do we mandate a forensic exam?
You offer it. You can offer forensic evidence collection or a referral to a specialized center, but you must strictly respect the patient's choice if they decline. And the text is incredibly clear on this point. You never, ever withhold medical treatment just because they refuse the forensic exam. Their immediate health and autonomy supersede the legal investigation.
Autonomy above all else. The chapter also talks about system-level considerations, how clinics need internal protocols, culturally sensitive care, and safety plans for the staff. But the one that stood out to me was the placement of resources, having pamphlets in patient bathrooms.
Well, think about the mechanics of control. A trafficker might escort the patient into the lobby, sign them in, sit in the exam room, and answer your questions.
Yeah.
The only place in the entire building where that patient is allowed to be alone behind a locked door is the bathroom. A simple hotline number taped to the back of a bathroom stall could be their only lifeline to the outside world.
It's chilling to think about a clinic bathroom as a sanctuary, but it makes complete sense. All right, the final major clinical topic in this chapter serves as perhaps the ultimate test of trauma-informed care. It's a specific global trauma. Female genital mutilation, or FGM.
Yes.
The text defines this as a global human rights violation involving the partial or total removal of external female genitalia for non-medical reasons.
It is a devastating practice, usually performed between infancy and adolescence, and the clinical gravity of assessing these patients cannot be overstated.
The exam requires the clinician to differentiate between 4 specific types. Let's go through the anatomy of these types so a student understands exactly what they're assessing.
Yes, accurate documentation and understanding the physiological fallout is critical here. Type 1 involves the partial or total removal of the clitoral glands and the prepuce, which is the clitoral hood.
Okay, and type 2?
Type 2 extends further. It involves the partial or total removal of the clitoral glands and the labia minora, and it may or may not include the removal of the labia majora.
And then there's type 3, which is also known as infibulation. This one sounds anatomically devastating. It involves narrowing the vaginal opening by cutting and repositioning the labia to create a covering seal.
They are literally creating a physical barrier, sometimes through stitching. Finally, type 4 is a catch-all category for all other harmful, non-medical procedures to the genitalia, so things like pricking, piercing, scraping, or cauterizing the area.
For a student seeing FGM for the first time, why is it so important to properly differentiate between, say, type 2 and type 3 infibulation? How does identifying that seal actually change the immediate care plan in the room?
It changes everything about their physical health trajectory.
Yeah.
When you understand the anatomy of type 3 infibulation, you understand the physiological nightmare the patient is living with. By sealing the vaginal opening, you trap bodily fluids.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, these patients often suffer from chronic severe urinary tract infections because urine cannot properly escape. They experience agonizing dysmenorrhea because menstrual blood backs up.
And obviously down the line, severe obstetric complications. I mean, if the opening is sealed, childbirth becomes incredibly dangerous without specialized surgical intervention.
Precisely. But bringing it back to the immediate clinic visit, understanding that anatomical reality perfectly loops back to the necessity of trauma-informed care. If a patient has type 3 FGM, their pelvic area is a site of excruciating physical and psychological trauma.
Right.
The standard pelvic exam tools might not even fit or cause immense pain.
So you can't just proceed with this standard speculum exam and tell them to, relax.
Exactly. You have to adapt. You move incredibly slowly. You narrate every single step. You give them the power to stop the exam at any second. Treating their immediate physical complaint while laying a foundation of absolute safety and bodily autonomy is the ultimate goal of the visit. You are not just diagnosing their anatomy, you are honoring their survival.
It all connects, whether it's a patient dealing with the hidden coercion of domestic sex trafficking or the visible lifelong scars of FGM, the core clinical skill is exactly the same. You have to read the unspoken physical clues, and you have to restore their agency through trauma-informed care.
And as we wrap up this clinical deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you head into your next shift or rotation. Think about the physical space you work in. We spend so much time focusing on our stethoscopes, our diagnostic criteria, and getting our charting perfectly coded.
Yeah, we do.
But the text reminds us that the environment itself is a medical tool. The simple act of placing a resource pamphlet in a clinic bathroom, the one place a trafficked individual might finally, briefly, be free from their coercer's gaze, could be the most profound, life-saving medical intervention you perform all day. How can you look at your own clinic space differently tomorrow?
That is the perfect question to end on. Taking the blinders off and seeing the whole environment and the whole patient as part of the care plan. I thank you so much for joining us on this intense but absolutely vital educational journey. Translating these dense clinical concepts into real-world practice is what it's all about. So until next time, concluding with a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.